The pediatric wing smelled clean in a way that felt too sharp, like the air itself had been scrubbed of comfort. Callum Wright adjusted his cuff once as he stepped off the elevator, the soft chime echoing longer than it should have. He wasn't here for a meeting. There were no executives waiting, no assistants hovering with tablets, no schedules demanding his attention. This visit wasn't on any calendar. The clinic administrator had asked him to stop by only because his name was on the building. A courtesy, a formality, the kind of quiet obligation that followed ownership. He had agreed without thinking, already halfway through a call about a delayed acquisition when the elevator doors opened. That was when everything shifted. Room 417. The door was slightly ajar. Callum slowed, though he didn't know why. He'd walked into thousands of rooms in his life. Boardrooms, server labs, courtrooms, private dining suites. None of them had ever made his chest tighten the way this one did. He pushed the door open. The first thing he noticed was the child. She sat on the exam table with her legs swinging gently, sneakers barely brushing the paper covering. Her hair was pulled back in a simple style, neat but practical. A thin hospital bracelet circled her wrist, oversized for how small she was. She was quiet, not fearful, not restless, observant. Her eyes lifted the moment he entered, and in that instant, the world lost its balance. Callum didn't stop walking because his mind told him to. His body made the decision before thought could catch up. One step inside the room, then another. His breath shortened, not from panic, but from recognition so sharp it felt physical. Those eyes. He had seen them every morning of his adult life. In mirrors, in old photographs, in reflections, caught accidentally on glass when he wasn't prepared to confront himself. Same shape, same stillness, same way of looking at the world, like it was something to be measured carefully before responding. The girl tilted her head, studying him with open curiosity. No fear, no confusion, just a child assessing a stranger who didn't feel entirely unfamiliar. Callum's hand tightened at his side. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because suddenly, things that had never fit together before snapped into place. Not like a puzzle solved slowly, like a truth striking all at once. His gaze dropped to her hands, long fingers for her age, the faint curve of her knuckles, a tiny scar near the thumb, old and healed. He had one just like it, from a childhood fall his mother used to remind him of whenever he acted too careful. His heartbeat thudded, heavy and uneven. The room felt smaller. A woman stood beside the exam table. Callum hadn't seen her yet. Not really. His focus had narrowed to the child with such intensity that everything else had blurred. But now his awareness expanded, and the second blow landed harder than the first. She didn't turn. She didn't look at him. Her posture was straight, shoulders set in a way he remembered too well. Protective, controlled, as if Every part of her had learned how to brace without being asked. Time folded in on itself. The last time he had seen her, she'd been standing in the doorway of his apartment, light from the hallway outlining her face while her phone rested in her hand. Hope had been there then, not loud, just present. Now there was none of that. Zariah adjusted the sleeve of the child's hoodie. Careful, deliberate. Her movements were practiced, maternal, grounded. This was not a woman waiting for answers. This was a woman who had learned to live without them. Callum swallowed. Still no words came. The child glanced between them, sensing the shift without understanding it. "Mama," she asked softly, voice calm but questioning. The sound of it did something to him. "Ma." Zariah's hand rested on the girl's knee, firm and reassuring. "It's okay," she said, her tone even. She did not look back. "Just give me 1 second. Nia?" Nia? The name settled into him like gravity. Callum's breath hitched. His eyes returned to the child, and this time he saw more than resemblance. He saw connection. He saw lineage. He saw the quiet confidence in her posture, the way she took in her surroundings without rushing to react. Traits built over generations. Traits that did not lie. The doctor, oblivious to the internal earthquake happening behind Callum's composed exterior, glanced at his chart. "Mr. Wright," he said politely, "thank you for stopping by. We were just—" Callum raised a hand. The gesture was subtle, but it stopped the room. "I need a moment," he said, his voice lower than usual, steadier than he felt. The doctor hesitated, then nodded. "Of course. I'll step out." The door closed softly behind him. Silence filled the space. Not the awkward kind, the kind that presses. Callum took one more step forward, not toward Zariah, toward the child. He stopped at a respectful distance, as if something sacred lay between them. She looked up at him again, curious, unafraid. Something inside him broke open, not violently, but completely. A quiet collapse of everything he thought he understood about his life. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't need proof, because no amount of denial could undo what his body already knew. This was his daughter, not because of biology alone, but because something ancient and undeniable had awakened in him the second their eyes met. Zariah's voice cut through his thoughts, calm, controlled, yielding. "You don't get to look at her like that." Callum turned slowly. She still hadn't faced him. "I wasn't—" His words stopped before they could become excuses. "I didn't know." Zariah let out a small breath, nada sigh, a release, as if she'd been carrying this moment for years and was finally setting it down. "You didn't know," she repeated. "That doesn't change what is." Finally, she turned. Their eyes met, and in that exchange, years of silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. No anger flared in her gaze, no accusation, just clarity, the kind forged through endurance. Callum had faced public scrutiny before. Lawsuits, media storms, boardroom battles that decided the fate of thousands of employees. None of that compared to this, because this wasn't about power. This was about presence. His voice came out rougher now. "A week." Zariah nodded once. "She's being monitored." "Is she?" "She's strong," Zariah said, cutting him off. "Stronger than you know." The child smiled faintly, as if on cue. Callum's throat tightened again. Everything he had built, every empire, every metric of success, felt small in the face of that smile. He straightened, forcing himself not to reach out, not to claim what he had no right to touch yet. "I'm here," he said quietly. Zariah studied him then, really looked, measured the weight of his words against the years he hadn't been present. "We'll see," she replied. The door opened again, the doctor returning with a nurse. The moment fractured, but the truth remained, solid and irreversible. Callum stepped back, giving space. His world had changed, and yet everything else kept moving, as if nothing had happened, as if hearts didn't split open every day, as if destinies didn't collide in quiet hospital rooms. Before the doctor could resume speaking, Callum turned once more toward the child. Nia met his gaze. Something passed between them. Not recognition, something deeper. "Promise, if you believe love stories should be told with heart, tap subscribe." The doctor spoke again, gentle and professional, as if the air in the room hadn't just shifted into something heavy. "So, Miss Coleman," he said, flipping a page on his clipboard, "Nia's vitals are stable. The fever has come down a little, but the blood work is what we're watching closely. We'll repeat the labs in a few hours, and we'll keep her here overnight for observation." Zariah nodded once, not because she was calm on the inside. She was calm because she had practiced calm. Calm was how she kept her daughter from picking up fear. Calm was how she kept her voice from cracking when she'd had to carry too much by herself. "Okay," she said. "One word. Firm. No trembling. No pleading." The kind of response a woman gives when she has learned that panic never pays bills and it never heals a child. Nia leaned slightly into Zariah's side. She looked small under the bright clinic light, but her eyes were alert, following every adult in the room as if she was learning how the world worked. Callum stood near the door, like he didn't know where to put his hands. He was used to rooms bending to him, used to people stepping aside, making space, offering him seats, water, deference. Here, no one did any of that, and Zariah didn't even acknowledge his presence unless she had to. It wasn't rude. It was deliberate, a boundary, a line drawn by a woman who had spent years teaching herself how not to fall apart in public. The nurse checked Nia's temperature, then offered her a sticker. Nia accepted it, politely, pressing it onto her hoodie like it was a badge of honor. Callum watched. He couldn't stop watching. He wanted to speak, to ask what she liked, to ask what grade she was in, to ask if she'd ever been to the lake in summer, or if she knew how to skate in winter. The kind of questions men ask when they're trying to build a bridge over water that already drowned someone. But the moment he opened his mouth, Zariah's gaze flicked toward him. Not fully, not warmly, just enough to warn him. No, not like that. Not around her. The doctor cleared his throat. "Mr. Wright," he said carefully, voice shifting into a respectful tone he probably used with donors. "Since you're here, I want to reassure you that our team—" Zariah turned to the doctor before Callum could respond. "I'm her mother," she said, the words calm but sharp enough to set the room in place. "So you can address me." There was no drama in it, no raised voice, just authority. The doctor blinked once, then nodded immediately. "Yes, of course. Ms. Coleman." Callum felt the sting of that. Not because she'd embarrassed him, but because she'd been forced to claim her position so clearly, as if the world would naturally try to give him ownership, simply because he had money and a last name. Zariah didn't allow it. She didn't have to look at him to remind everyone who had done the real work. The doctor continued speaking to her, outlining the plan: hydration, observation, possible imaging if symptoms returned. Zariah listened like someone who had learned how to become an expert in her child's well-being because no one else could afford to care as much. Callum's gaze drifted again to the bracelet on Nia's wrist. A hospital band, a reminder, a line of printed letters that said her name, her date of birth, her patient number. Callum didn't know the date on that band, and the truth hit him again, colder this time. There were years of her life he could never get back, not because the universe stole them, because something or someone kept him away, and because he hadn't fought hard enough to find out why. The nurse stepped out. The doctor excused himself to check on another patient. The door clicked shut. Now it was just the three of them. Zariah didn't speak. She moved to the small counter near the sink and began organizing the items she'd brought. Nia's water bottle, a small pouch with wipes, a neatly folded sweater, a snack pack she hadn't opened yet. Didn't rush, didn't fidget. Her movements were measured, like she was building a wall, one brick at a time. Callum's throat tightened. Zariah. She didn't answer. He tried again, softer. Zariah. Still nothing. Nia looked between them, sensing the tension in the way kids do, like they can hear feelings even when adults don't say them out loud. "Mama," Nia whispered. "Who is he?" Zariah froze, only for half a second. Then she turned to her daughter, crouched down to her level, and smoothed the collar of her hoodie. "A person who owns the building," she said, voice steady. "And someone we're going to be polite to." That was it. Not a lie, not the full truth, just enough to keep a child's world from tipping. Callum swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay quiet while she spoke to Nia. He could see Zariah's strategy without her explaining it. Protect her daughter first, process everything else later. Do I have to talk to him? Nia asked. Zariah gave her a small smile. That didn't reach her eyes. No, baby. You don't have to do anything you don't want to do. Callum's hands clenched. He wanted to say, I want to talk to her. But Zariah's words made the message clear. This child has choices. And you, Callum, don't get to force yourself into them. Nia nodded like she understood. Then she leaned back against the pillow, quiet again, staring at the sticker on her hoodie. Zariah stood slowly. Finally, she faced him fully. Callum felt his chest tighten again, because seeing her head-on after all these years was different. She looked older, not in a broken way, in a sharpened way, like time had carved her into someone harder to bend. Her eyes held experience, not bitterness. Experience. You don't get to do this, she said. Callum's brow tightened. Do what? She took a step closer. Not close enough to touch him, but close enough that her voice didn't need to rise. You don't get to walk into a room after all this time and look at her like your life just changed, Zariah said, her tone controlled, almost quiet. My life changed a long time ago. Callum's mouth opened, but she didn't let him take the easy road. And don't come in here with a face full of regret, like that's supposed to move me, she added. I've had to keep going without your regret, without your questions, without your help. His voice came low. Didn't abandon you. Zariah's stare didn't flinch. You disappeared. I was told. Stop, she said, a single word cutting clean through him. Stop trying to make this about what you were told. Callum exhaled. His eyes darted to Nia, then back to Zariah. I'm not trying to take anything from you, he said. Zariah let out a short breath. Not laughter, not scoffing, just the sound of someone hearing a line she didn't ask for. You don't even know what you took, she replied. Callum's jaw tightened. Then tell me. Zariah's eyes held him for a long moment. Then she spoke slower. I took buses to doctor appointments while my feet were swollen, she said. I worked double shifts when I was tired enough to see spots, because rent doesn't care about pregnancy. I sat up at night with my hand on my stomach, begging God to let my baby be healthy, because I didn't have anybody else to put my fear on. Her voice stayed level, but every word had weight. I did it all, she continued. With you. Callum felt his eyes sting, but he refused to blink too hard. Not because he wanted to look strong, because he didn't want to miss anything she was saying. You think showing up now makes you noble? Zariah asked softly. Doesn't. It makes you late. Callum swallowed. I know I'm late, he admitted. Zariah's face didn't soften. She turned her head slightly, eyes flicking to Nia again, and her entire posture changed in a split second. Mother first. That little girl on that bed. she said. She's not a problem you can fix with money. She's not a headline you can clean up. She's a human being who has been loved completely every day of her life. Callum nodded slowly. I can see that. Zariah's voice lowered even more. So understand this, she said. You're not here to rescue her. I already did that. Callum's breath caught. He felt it then. The way her strength wasn't loud, wasn't flashy. It wasn't meant to impress anybody. It was survival refined into discipline. He had met powerful people his whole life. Zariah's power was different. It came from endurance, and it made him feel smaller than any billionaire balance sheet ever could. Callum looked down for a second, then back up. What do you want from me? Zariah blinked slowly, like she was weighing the question. Against years, she didn't have the luxury to waste. I want you to be honest, she said. But with Callum nodded once. I want consistency, she continued. Not dramatic promises, not grand gestures, not a sudden interest that fades when things get uncomfortable. She took a step back, letting the words hang in the air. And if you can't do that, she said, then you should leave right now and never come back, because I will not let her get attached to someone who might disappear again. Callum's chest tightened. He glanced at Nia, quiet, listening, without looking like she was listening. Children always hear more than adults want them to. Callum lowered his voice. I'm not leaving. Zariah stared at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, a single, small nod. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, just acknowledgement. We'll see, she said again, and in those two words, Callum heard the truth. This was not a door he could buy open. This was a doorway he would have to earn, one day at a time, under the watch of a woman who had already proven she could do life without him. Zariah turned back toward Nia, smoothing her blanket, adjusting the pillow behind her head. She didn't give Callum another look. Not because she was weak, because she was in control. Callum stood there, feeling like a man who had just stepped into the life he should have been living all along. Only now he had to stand at the edges and prove he belonged. Outside, the clinic hallway stayed bright and busy. Inside room 417, everything had changed. But Zariah kept moving like it hadn't, like she refused to let any man's return shake the world she'd built with her own hands. There are moments in life that don't announce themselves with noise. They arrive quietly, in a hospital room, in a look you can't explain, in the presence of someone you thought you'd never see again, standing exactly where they matter most. And sometimes those moments ask a question that follows you long after the room goes silent. What would you do if the person who vanished from your life returned when it mattered most? Not when you lonely, not when you were searching, but when the stakes were higher than pride, higher than anger, higher than the past? That question sits at the heart of this story. If you're new here, welcome. And if you've been here before, welcome back. This is American Love Stories, where love isn't polished, perfect, or effortless. It's tested, it's earned, and sometimes it shows up late, but with consequences that can't be ignored. What you just witnessed wasn't a reunion. It was a collision. A woman who learned how to survive alone. A man who believed silence had erased his past. And a child standing at the center of a truth that refused to stay hidden. This story doesn't ask you to choose sides easily, because from the outside, the narrative looks familiar. Billionaire, a woman he left behind, a secret child, revealed at the worst possible moment. But the truth is never that simple. Let's be honest. From where most people sit, what Callum did looks unforgivable. He vanished. No explanation, no follow-up, no protection for the woman carrying his child. And the chaos that followed wasn't loud or public. It was private. Lived in cramped apartments, carried on tired bodies, managed through faith, routine, and community. Meanwhile, Callum's life moved forward. Success multiplied. His name grew heavier with influence, and the version of the story he believed allowed him to keep going. Two people living with opposite truths until fate forced them into the same room. That's where betrayal meets consequence. Not in a courtroom, not in the media, but face to face with a child who doesn't know she's the answer to questions no one ever asked out loud. Now, let's talk about the layers people don't always say out loud. Zariah is a black woman raised in a world where support doesn't come from systems. It comes from people. Where strength isn't optional. Where showing up matters more than titles. Callum is a white billionaire shaped by privilege, structure, and access. A man who learned early that problems could be managed, delegated, or delayed. When their lives crossed, love didn't erase those differences. It moved through them. And when things fell apart, those same differences shaped who was protected and who was left holding the weight. Zariah didn't have the luxury of disappearing. She didn't get to rewrite her narrative. She didn't get a pause button. She carried on because she had to. That imbalance, race, class, gender, power, isn't background noise in this story. It's part of the conflict. Because when someone returns with resources after years of absence, the question becomes, is that redemption or control disguised as help? At its core, this story isn't about wealth or status. It's about invisibility. Zariah knows what it feels like to be unseen while doing the hardest work of her life. Callum knows what it feels like to be praised publicly while something essential remains empty inside. And Nia, without even knowing the full truth, stands as proof that what's ignored doesn't disappear. Everyone watching this has felt some version of that. Being overlooked, being underestimated, being left to handle something heavy, alone, while the world assumed you were fine. Maybe it was a relationship. Maybe it was parenthood. Maybe it was a moment where you showed up and no one else did. This story asks you to sit with that feeling, not to rush past it, because healing doesn't come from pretending the past didn't happen. It comes from deciding what happens next. So here's the question that matters now. Was Callum cruel? Or was something hidden from both of them? Did he choose silence? Or was silence chosen for him? More importantly, what does accountability look like when showing up late is the only option left? This isn't a story where money fixes everything. It's a story where consistency is tested, where love isn't loud, where forgiveness isn't guaranteed, and where a woman who already saved herself must decide how much space, if any, there is for the man who left. If you've ever wondered whether people can truly change, if effort can outweigh absence, if trust can be rebuilt without erasing the past, then stay, because what unfolds next isn't about rescue. It's about reckoning. And the truth, when it finally comes out, will challenge everything you think you know about love, responsibility, and what it really means to show up. If stories like this matter to you, stories with heart, depth, and real consequences, make sure you're subscribed. And let us know in the comments. What would you do if someone who vanished came back when it mattered most? Zariah Coleman learned early that life didn't pause just because you were tired. She was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, in a neighborhood where mornings began with the sound of buses pulling away from corners and evenings ended with porch conversations that lasted until the streetlights blinked on. Her world wasn't loud with luxury, but it was full of voices, opinions, laughter, correction, and expectation. Her mother, Lorraine Coleman, believed in three things with an unshakable steadiness: showing up, telling the truth, and keeping your name clean. Lorraine worked long hours as a nursing assistant, the kind of job that demanded both strength and patience. She came home tired, but never careless. Dinner might be simple, but it was always shared. Conversation wasn't optional. Respect wasn't negotiable. From the time Zariah could reach the stove, she learned how to help, not because her mother demanded obedience, but because participation was how love was expressed. You didn't sit back and wait for life to happen. You stepped into it. Sundays belonged to church, not just the building, but everything around it. The early morning bustle, the pressed clothes, the familiar faces that felt like extended family. Church wasn't a performance. It grounding, a place where women held one another up without explanation, where children learned that discipline and joy could exist side by side, and where hardship wasn't hidden. It was acknowledged and carried together. Zariah grew up watching women lead without titles. Aunties who organized meals when someone fell sick. Neighbors who watched kids without asking for favors in return. Elders who corrected you firmly and hugged you just as hard afterward. Black community life wasn't an idea to her. It was structure, it was safety, it was accountability, and it taught her something crucial. Dignity didn't come from ease. It came from endurance. By her teenage years, Zariah understood how to navigate pressure without losing herself. She balanced school with part-time work, learned when to speak and when to listen, and developed a quiet confidence that didn't depend on applause. She laughed easily, but she paid attention. She trusted carefully. Her friendships ran deep. Girls she grew up with became women alongside her. They shared clothes, secrets, heartbreaks, and plans that shifted with reality. They learned early that dreams had to be flexible, but values couldn't be. Zariah was never naive, but she wasn't hardened either. She believed in love because she'd seen it work in imperfect ways. Couples who argued and stayed, families who struggled and adapted, communities that didn't disappear when things got uncomfortable. That belief would matter later, because when life tested her, it wouldn't be gentle. And when silence eventually entered her story, she would already know how to stand without leaning on it. Callum Wright grew up in a world where problems were handled quietly. He was raised in a large home with long hallways and carefully chosen artwork, pieces that were meant to be admired, not questioned. His parents valued excellence, restraint, and reputation. Feelings weren't ignored, but they were managed. You didn't dwell. You didn't overshare. You certainly didn't fall apart where others could see. From a young age, Callum learned how to observe before speaking, how to calculate before reacting. His schools were private, his classes small, his future discussed long before he was old enough to understand its weight. Achievement was expected. Failure was unacceptable, but not punished loudly. Instead, disappointment arrived through distance, through silence at dinner, through raised brows and quiet conversations behind closed doors. Callum excelled because he learned that control was safer than vulnerability. He discovered early that intelligence could create distance from discomfort. That success earned approval without requiring emotional exposure. By the time he entered adulthood, discipline had become instinctive. Wealth followed him naturally, not because he chased it recklessly, but because he understood systems. He built companies with precision, scaled ideas efficiently, and learned how to separate emotion from execution. The world praised him for it, but inside, Callum often felt untouched by the things that were supposed to matter. Relationships came and went. Social events blurred together. He showed up, smiled politely, and left before conversations went too deep. It wasn't cruelty. It was insulation. Legacy weighed on him more than people realized. Expectations passed down quietly, never spoken directly, but always present. He carried the pressure to maintain the right name, not through warmth, but through success. Love, when it appeared, felt unfamiliar. He didn't distrust it, but he didn't know how to live inside it either. So when someone finally looked at him without needing anything from him, it unsettled him. The event wasn't supposed to matter. A charity tech education fundraiser hosted in a converted industrial space downtown. Clean lines, neutral colors, polite conversations, layered with ambition. Callum attended because his foundation funded several of the programs being highlighted. His presence was expected. His name was already on the donor list. Zariah was there because her community center had been selected as a beneficiary. She arrived early, helping set up tables, organizing pamphlets, making sure the kids who had been invited understood where to stand and when to speak. She wasn't dressed for attention. She was dressed to participate. When Callum first noticed her, it wasn't because she was loud. It was because she wasn't impressed. She listened when he spoke, but she didn't nod automatically. When he explained a program's metrics, she asked how many kids actually stayed in the program long term. When he mentioned scaling, she asked about retention. It caught him off guard. Their first real conversation happened near the refreshment table. "You talk like someone who's seen the results up close," Callum said. Zariah smiled slightly. "I have. Not flirtatious, not guarded, just honest." They talked longer than either expected. About access, about education gaps, about what happens when programs end and communities are left to manage the aftermath. Callum realized something strange. He felt present. Zariah realized something else. He was listening, not to impress her, but to understand. Their connection didn't spark dramatically. It unfolded. Late dinners followed. Walks through the city. Conversations that didn't rush toward labels. They learned one another slowly, through curiosity, not fantasy. Zariah challenged him without belittling him. Callum offered support without trying to control. Their worlds didn't merge. They overlapped, and for the first time in a long time, both felt like something real was taking shape, without noise, without performance. Neither of them knew then that silence was already waiting ahead, that choices made by others would interrupt what they were building, that love, when left without protection, can be mistaken for something disposable. But in those early moments, before everything fractured, they were simply two people learning how to see each other clearly. Zariah and Callum never announced what they were building. There were no public introductions, no carefully curated appearances, no photographs meant to signal permanence. What existed between them lived in smaller spaces, moments that didn't ask to be witnessed. They walked the city instead of dining in places where people would recognize him. Long stretches of sidewalk where conversation mattered more than destination. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. Silence between them didn't feel awkward. It felt earned. Callum learned quickly that Zariah didn't fill space just to be heard. When she spoke, it was because something needed to be said. He found himself listening in a way that surprised him, without waiting to respond, without planning his next sentence. Their playlists became shared territory. Songs traded late at night, accompanied by short messages explaining why something mattered. Music turned into language when words felt unnecessary. Zariah introduced him to artists he hadn't grown up hearing, sounds rooted in memory and meaning. Callum shared instrumental tracks he used to think through problems, rhythms that helped him focus. Late nights followed naturally, not rushed, not careless. They talked about childhood in fragments. Zariah spoke of her mother's firmness, her community's watchful care, the way responsibility arrived early but never felt like punishment. Callum shared less at first, offering controlled pieces, schools, expectations, ambition, before slowly admitting how isolating excellence could feel. Neither of them made promises. That was the unspoken agreement. They didn't label what they were becoming, because neither wanted to break it by forcing it into shape too soon. Zariah had learned that love announced too early often collapsed under the weight of expectation. Callum had learned that commitments made before understanding could become obligations instead of choices. So they moved carefully, intentionally, emotionally close, without declarations. Callum noticed how Zariah paid attention to details others missed, how she remembered the names of people he mentioned only once, how she noticed when his mood shifted before he did. Zariah noticed how Callum showed care through consistency, how he never canceled plans casually, how he followed through quietly. It felt safe, not because it was guaranteed, but because it was honest. They existed in a space where affection didn't need witnesses and connection didn't demand validation. Love took shape not through grand gestures, but through presence. And for a while, that was enough. Zariah realized something was different before the test confirmed it. Her body knew first. The fatigue felt heavier than usual, settling into her bones in a way rest didn't fix. Food tasted sharper. Smells lingered longer. She brushed it off at first. Life was busy. Work demanded focus. Stress could explain a lot. Still, something nudged at her awareness. When she finally stood in her bathroom, holding the test, she didn't feel panic. She felt still. The result appeared clearly. No ambiguity. No confusion. Positive. Zariah sat on the edge of the tub for a long time after, one hand resting on her thigh, the other holding the plastic stick like it might speak. Her mind didn't race. It organized. She thought of her mother, of the women she grew up watching. Strong, imperfect, steady. She thought of Callum, not with fear, with consideration. Hope surfaced quietly, not the reckless kind, but the kind grounded in possibility. She imagined telling him, not dramatically, not as a demand, but as information that belonged to both of them. She believed he would want to know. She believed he would show up. Zariah had never been careless with her heart, and she wasn't careless now. She didn't tell anyone immediately. She sat with the truth, letting it settle, letting herself feel what it meant. This wasn't a crisis to her. It was a reability, and she intended to face it with clarity. When she decided to tell Callum, she chose a moment that felt right, quiet, unhurried. She didn't rehearse speeches or prepare for conflict. She trusted the foundation they had built. Hope guided her, not fear. The message arrived without warning. Zariah was in her apartment, phone resting on the counter, while she folded laundry. She had sent Callum a text earlier that day, asking when they could talk. Nothing urgent, just a question. When her phone buzzed, she smiled before she even read it. That smile didn't last. The words were short, carefully written, cold. Callum told her not to contact him again. That what they had needed to end. That it was better this way. No explanation followed. No acknowledgement of her attempt to speak. No curiosity. Just distance. Zariah stared at the screen, reading the message again and again, as if repetition might change its meaning. Her chest tightened. She typed a response, then deleted it. Typed again. Stopped. She waited. Minutes passed. Then hours. No follow-up came. That night, she sat on her couch, phone in her hand, the room too quiet. One hand drifted to her stomach without her realizing it. The weight of the moment pressed down slowly, not all at once. This was the moment everything shifted, not because love ended, but because silence replaced it. Zariah didn't cry immediately. She breathed. She thought. She tried to understand how something built carefully could be dismissed so easily. Days followed with no clarification. Weeks stretched on. The truth settled painfully. Callum wasn't coming back. Whatever he believed, whatever he had been told, had closed the door completely, and Zariah, carrying life inside her, faced the reality she had hoped would never come. She was alone. The devastation wasn't loud. It was internal. It reshaped her expectations, hardened her resolve, and taught her a lesson she would carry forward. Love without protection can disappear without warning, but responsibility never does. This was the second rupture, the moment where hope fractured into survival. And from that fracture, Zariah would rebuild everything that followed. Zariah sat alone on the edge of her couch, long after the city outside her window settled into its late-night rhythm. The apartment was quiet, in the way spaces become when they stop expecting company. A lamp near the corner cast a soft glow across folded laundry and a stack of unopened mail. The television remained off. Noise felt unnecessary. Her phone rested in her hand. The screen was dark now, but the message still lived behind her eyes. Short sentences. Final, carefully distant. Each word chosen to close a door without leaving fingerprints. She had reread it enough times to know there was nothing hidden inside it. No coded meaning. No invitation to ask questions. Just an ending delivered without ceremony. Zariah leaned back against the couch and stared at the ceiling. She counted her breaths, not as a coping exercise, but as a habit learned early. Slow the body first, let the mind catch up later. Shock didn't arrive dramatically. It came as a dull pressure in her chest, like a weight she hadn't agreed to carry but somehow had to balance anyway. Her phone buzzed once more. She straightened, heart lifting despite herself. It was a group chat notification. A meme. Laughter she wasn't part of tonight. Zariah exhaled and set the phone face down on the coffee table. She walked to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and stood there, drinking it slowly. The ordinary motion grounded her. The body knows how to survive, even when the heart hasn't caught up yet. Her other hand drifted to her stomach. The truth settled deeper now, heavier than before. This wasn't just a breakup. This was absence at the worst possible moment. She returned to the couch and sat again, this time pulling a throw blanket over her shoulders. The room felt colder than it had earlier. Or maybe she was simply more aware of the quiet. Zariah didn't cry right away. She let the reality arrive in pieces. First came disbelief, not denial, but the quiet confusion of how something that felt steady could end without conversation. Then came anger, brief and contained, not explosive, focused, directed inward as much as outward. Finally came clarity. Whatever Callum believed, whatever story he was living inside, she could not rely on him. Not for reassurance, not for explanation, not for protection. And the life growing inside her could not wait for answers. Zariah straightened her spine and made a decision she didn't speak out loud. If she was going to be alone, she would be prepared. If she was going to be abandoned, she would not be undone. She reached for her phone once more, not to respond, not to plead, not to explain, but to set reminders. Doctor appointments, work schedules, budget notes, practical things, necessary things. By the time she lay down that night, the ache remained, but it no longer ruled the room. That night didn't break her. It rearranged her priorities. Pregnancy changed Zariah's days before it changed her body. Mornings became slower. Evenings arrived heavier. Fatigue didn't ask permission. It settled where it wanted. She adjusted without complaint, learning how to pace herself through workdays that refused to shorten just because her life had grown more complicated. She didn't tell Callum again. She didn't chase clarity from someone who had chosen distance. Instead, she told her mother. Lorraine listened without interruption, eyes steady, hands folded in her lap. When Zariah finished, there was no lecture, no shock, just a deep breath. "Okay," her mother said, "we'll handle it." Those 3 words mattered more than any apology ever could. Doctor visits meant early buses and careful scheduling. Zariah learned which routes were reliable and which drivers waited an extra second when they saw her moving slower. She carried snacks in her bag, water bottles, a small notebook where she wrote questions for appointments so nothing important slipped through cracks created by exhaustion. Some days were harder than others. Her feet swelled, her back ached, sleep came in fragments. Still, she showed up to work, to appointments, to her own life. Community filled the spaces where one person should have been. Women from church checked in without hovering. Friends dropped off meals and stayed just long enough to make her laugh. No one asked invasive questions. No one made assumptions. They simply showed up. Zariah learned something powerful during those months. Support doesn't always come from who you expect. It comes from who refuses to let you stand alone. She talked to her baby sometimes while riding the bus, one hand resting gently over her stomach. Quiet words, promises she meant. "You're safe," she whispered once, voice barely louder than the hum of the engine. "I've got you." Fear came and went, but it never settled. She acknowledged it without feeding it. Planning gave her confidence. Preparation gave her control. Pregnancy without him was not easy, but it was honest, and honesty, she discovered, was a form of strength. Labor began before sunrise. Zariah noticed the pain before she named it, pausing mid-movement as a tightness wrapped low around her back and moved forward. She didn't panic. She checked the clock, timed the next wave, reached for her bag, already packed and waiting by the door. Her mother arrived quickly, coat thrown on over sleepwear, eyes alert. No questions needed. They moved with quiet efficiency, the kind built through years of knowing what mattered most in urgent moments. At the hospital, hours passed in measured stages. Pain rose and fell. Zariah focused on breathing, on posture, on keeping her voice steady. Nurses offered encouragement. Lorraine held her hand without squeezing too tightly. There was no audience, no dramatic declarations, just work. When Nia finally arrived, the room shifted in a way Zariah hadn't expected. The pain receded, replaced by something grounding and immediate. Purpose. She held her daughter close, studying her tiny face with focused attention. The world narrowed to that moment, to that weight in her arms, to the quiet strength filling her chest. Tears came then, but not from heartbreak, from resolve. Zariah pressed her forehead gently against Nia's and whispered her name like a promise. This child wasn't a reminder of what she'd lost. She was a reason to move forward with clarity. Lorraine watched, eyes soft but proud. "You did good," she said simply. Zariah nodded, exhausted but steady. She had done good, not because everything had gone according to plan, but because she had stayed present through every step. That day marked a beginning, not an ending. Love didn't leave her. It changed shape. And as Zariah held her daughter, she understood something fully for the first time. Her life wasn't defined by who walked away. It was defined by who she chose to stand for. If this story reminds you of a woman's strength, let us know in the comments. Zariah did not raise Nia loudly. She raised her deliberately. The early years were shaped by routine, morning checklists, packed lunches, carefully chosen childcare, bedtime rituals that never changed even when Zariah came home tired. Stability mattered. Predictability mattered. Children Zariah believed, deserved to know what came next. Nia grew into a thoughtful child, curious, observant, slow to speak, but quick to understand. Zariah noticed it early. The way her daughter listened more than she talked. The way she studied people before trusting them. Some traits were inherited. Others were learned from watching a mother who weighed her words carefully. Zariah protected Nia without suffocating her. She explained the world honestly, but gently. She taught her how to greet elders, how to say thank you without prompting, how to stand up straight when spoken to. Manners weren't about obedience. They were about respect for self and others. At home, love was consistent. Zariah made sure Nia knew she was wanted, not through gifts, but through attention, through eye contact, through being present. When Nia asked questions, Zariah answered them fully, even when the answers were uncomfortable. There were boundaries. Some truths were not yet for a child. When Nia asked about her father, Zariah didn't lie. "He's not in our lives," she said calmly the first time. "But that doesn't mean you're missing anything." Nia accepted that explanation more easily than Zariah expected. Children often do when they are surrounded by enough love to fill the gaps adults worry about. Zariah shielded her daughter, not by pretending pain didn't exist, but by refusing to let it define them. School mornings came with hair neatly styled, backpacks zipped, reminders given without shouting. Evenings brought homework at the table, music playing low, conversations about the day. Zariah paid attention to Nia's moods, noticing when something felt off before words formed. She stayed involved. Teachers knew her name. Coaches saw her on the sidelines. Other parents recognized her as the woman who listened more than she talked, but whose presence carried weight. Zariah taught Nia values without speeches. She modeled integrity, showed kindness without expecting praise, corrected gently but firmly, apologized when made mistakes. Motherhood didn't erase Zariah's identity. It sharpened it. She learned how to make decisions quickly and live with them confidently. How to say no without guilt. How to prioritize without explanation. Some nights, after Nia was asleep, Zariah sat quietly and allowed herself a moment to breathe. Not to mourn, but to acknowledge how far she had come. She had built a life that didn't depend on someone else's return. And that life was strong. From the outside, Callum Wright's life looked complete. His companies expanded steadily, breaking into new markets, acquiring smaller firms, setting records. Articles praised his discipline, his vision, his restraint. Interviews painted him as focused, composed, forward-thinking. Success followed success, but fulfillment did not. Callum spent most of his days in meetings and most of his nights alone. Social invitations came often, but he declined more than he accepted. Relationships remained surface level. Connections stayed professional. He told himself that this was the cost of ambition. That sacrifice was necessary. That loneliness was temporary. What he never admitted at least not out loud, was that something had been missing since Zariah vanished from his life. In his version of the story, she had chosen distance. Messages he never received. Calls he never saw. Silence, he believed, was intentional. He assumed she had decided to move on without him. That belief settled deep. Callum buried questions under work. When doubt crept in, he silenced it with productivity. When memories surfaced, he reframed them as distractions. He never spoke her name, not because it hurt too much, but because acknowledging it threatened the narrative he relied on to keep moving. Years passed. Achievements stacked higher, yet moments of quiet unsettled him. He would catch himself pausing during routine tasks, mind drifting to conversations that never finished, to laughter shared in private spaces, to a connection that hadn't demanded performance. He wondered sometimes, briefly, what might have happened if things had gone differently, but he never chased the thought. The empire needed him, and empires don't wait for unresolved emotions. Callum told himself he had done what he could with the information he had, that if Zariah wanted him to know something, she would have reached out. That belief hardened over time. It allowed him to keep going without confronting the ache underneath his success. But emptiness has a way of waiting, and no amount of expansion can fill a space created by absence. Callum's life moved forward, polished and profitable. Zariah's life moved forward, grounded and full. They existed in parallel, separate, complete in different ways, until fate forced those two paths to cross again. Zariah noticed the change before anyone else did. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind of thing that sends a parent rushing in panic. It began as a slight pause in Nia's energy, shorter steps on the walk home from school, a quietness that lingered longer than usual after dinner. Nia still smiled, still laughed at the right moments, still completed her homework with care. But Zariah had learned to trust the small signals. Mothers who pay attention don't wait for certainty. They listen to pattern. Nia began asking to lie down earlier in the evenings. She complained once about a headache, then brushed it off as quickly as she mentioned it. Her appetite shifted. Not gone, just different. Foods she usually loved stayed on the plate longer. Zariah took note without alarm. She checked Nia's temperature. Normal. She asked questions casually, never pressing, never projecting worry. Children, she knew, borrow fear from adults before they understand their own. Days passed. Then, one morning, Nia moved slower, getting out of bed. Not struggling, just slower. Zariah felt the shift settle in her chest. "Are you okay, baby?" she asked gently. "I'm fine," Nia said, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. Zariah nodded, accepting the answer while filing it away. At school pickup, Nia leaned against her more than usual. That was enough. That evening, Zariah sat at the kitchen table after Nia went to bed and made calls. Not frantic, purposeful. She described symptoms clearly. She asked questions. She requested appointments. The first doctor visit brought reassurance, but not relief. Basic tests came back inconclusive. The doctor suggested monitoring. Zariah agreed, but she didn't settle. She watched. Over the next week, Nia's energy dipped again. Nothing alarming, nothing urgent, but enough to confirm what Zariah already felt in her bones. Something wasn't right. A community program she'd once helped coordinate came to mind. A healthcare partnership offering referrals to pediatric specialists. It wasn't something she used often. She preferred familiarity, but instinct pushed her forward. The referral came through quicker than expected. A private pediatric clinic downtown. The cost made her hesitate, not because she couldn't manage it, but because she didn't like owing systems anything. Still, Nia came first. Zariah scheduled the appointment. She didn't know the building's history. She didn't know who owned it. She only knew that her daughter needed answers. The morning of the visit, Zariah braided Nia's hair carefully, choosing a style that would last through a long day. She packed snacks, water, and a book. Nia liked to read when waiting felt endless. On the bus ride downtown, Nia leaned against her shoulder. Zariah wrapped an arm around her and stared out the window, her reflection steady in the glass. Whatever this was, she would face it head on. She always had. The building stood taller than most on the block. Clean lines, polished stone, understated design meant to inspire trust without intimidation. Zariah noticed details automatically. Wide entrances, accessible doors, staff who made eye contact instead of rushing past. That felt efficient. It felt prepared. What it didn't feel like was familiar. At the reception desk, Zariah checked in without fuss. Nia sat beside her, swinging her legs gently, book balanced on her knees. They were led to an exam room on the 4th floor. Room 417. Zariah helped Nia onto the table, smoothing the paper beneath her, adjusting the cuff of her sleeve. She listened carefully as the nurse asked routine questions, answered clearly, filled gaps where needed. When the nurse stepped out, Zariah exhaled slowly. "This place is nice," Nia said. Zariah smiled. "That doesn't matter. What matters is they listen." Nia nodded, trusting that explanation fully. Minutes passed. Then footsteps approached. Zariah expected the doctor. Instead, the door opened, and the room shifted. Callum Wright stepped inside. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not in Zariah's life. Not in this space. Not now. His presence filled the doorway without effort. Tall, composed, dressed simply but expensively. He stopped short the moment he registered who stood before him. Zariah froze, not from fear, from shock so sudden It stole the air from her lungs. Time didn't slow. It sharpened. Callum's eyes moved first to her, then to the child sitting on the exam table, and something inside him collapsed inward. Nia looked up, curious but calm. Callum didn't need confirmation. Recognition arrived without words. The shape of her face, the stillness in her gaze, the familiar way she observed before reacting. His body responded before his mind caught up. This wasn't speculation. This was knowing. His breath shortened. His hands tightened at his sides. The room felt smaller. Zariah stepped forward slightly, not to confront him, but to position herself between him and Nia without making it obvious. Callum noticed. That subtle movement broke something open in him. He understood instantly what that posture meant. Protection. Years of absence crystallized in a single second. He stopped himself. The words wouldn't come out, right? Not here? No, now. Nia glanced between them. "Mama?" she asked softly. Zariah rested a hand on her knee. "It's okay." Callum watched the exchange, like a man standing outside his own life. The doctor entered behind him, unaware of the history that had just slammed into the room. "Mr. Wright, thank you for stopping by. Since you own the facility, Zariah turned to the doctor, voice steady. "I'm her mother." The doctor paused, recalibrated immediately. "Of course, Ms. Coleman." Callum felt the correction land, not as embarrassment, but as truth. He didn't belong in this moment. Not yet. The doctor explained procedures, next steps, observations. Zariah listened closely, asked precise questions. Callum remained silent, absorbing everything without interrupting. When the doctor stepped out again, the room fell quiet. Callum finally spoke. His voice was low, controlled. "She's mine." Wasn't a claim. It was an acknowledgement. Zariah didn't argue. She didn't confirm it either. "She's my responsibility," she replied calmly. Callum nodded. I know. The weight of everything he had missed pressed down on him then, not as regret, but as reckoning. Years he couldn't reclaim. Moments he hadn't earned. A child who had grown strong without him. His success suddenly felt hollow. All of it, the buildings, the accolades, the influence, none of it mattered here. Zariah watched him carefully, not with anger, but with assessment. She had learned not to trust words in moments like this. Consistency would speak later. For now, there was a child who needed care. Callum stepped back, giving space. "Whatever she needs," he said quietly, "I'll cover it." Zariah met his eyes fully then. "This isn't about money." "I know," he replied, and for the first time, she believed him. Callum's composure held, but inside, everything fractured. Not outwardly, inward. The recognition wasn't dramatic. It was devastating in its simplicity. This was his daughter. He had been absent. No empire could shield him from that truth. The truth did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, unearthed slowly, reluctantly, and with a weight that pressed harder each time another piece fell into place. Callum didn't sleep the night after leaving the clinic. He sat in his office long after the city settled, staring at a wall of glass that reflected a man he barely recognized. Not the executive the world applauded. Not the strategist praised for precision. Just a man reckoning with the possibility that his life had been shaped by a lie. He replayed the past with new eyes. Zariah's unanswered messages, the sudden cutoff, the certainty he had carried, that she had chosen to disappear. That certainty no longer held. The first crack came from an old email archive. Callum searched her name, not expecting much. Their early messages appeared easily, warm, thoughtful, layered with curiosity. Then there was a gap, a clean break, too clean. He scrolled deeper into system logs he had never thought to revisit. Messages flagged, redirected, filtered, intercepted. His pulse quickened. Callum called his longtime systems analyst, not as a boss, but as a man asking for clarity. No accusations, just questions. The findings were careful, verified, comfortable. Several of Zariah's messages had never reached him. They had been rerouted through an intermediary system used during a corporate security transition years earlier, one overseen by someone he had trusted implicitly. A third party, someone with access, someone with motive. Phone records followed. Blocked numbers he never blocked. Voicemails that never surfaced. Missed calls rerouted to silence. The realization settled in his chest like gravity. He hadn't been abandoned. He had been cut off. Callum leaned back in his chair, hands covering his face. Not in disbelief, but in recognition. The memory of that final message he had sent her now felt poisoned. Not born from truth, but from manipulation layered carefully over time. Someone had decided that their separation served a purpose, and he had accepted it without question. Betrayal reframed itself then, not as something Zariah had done to him, but as something done to both of them. The worst part wasn't the interference. It was how easily he had believed it, how quickly he had chosen distance instead of clarity, how readily he had protected his pride instead of fighting for understanding. By the time dawn crept into the room, Callum no longer felt confusion. He felt responsibility. Callum didn't go to Zariah immediately, not because he hesitated, but because he refused to arrive unprepared. Truth demanded care. He spent days verifying everything, cross-checking records, confronting the individual responsible, not with rage, but with precision. The admission came without resistance. Motives revealed themselves plainly: control, gain, convenience. None of it mattered now. What mattered was what had been lost, and what still stood a chance to be built. When Callum finally stood outside the clinic again, it wasn't with speeches rehearsed or apologies polished. It was with understanding heavy enough to keep him grounded. Zariah met him in a quiet hallway, away from Nia. Her posture remained steady, alert, yielding. "I know what happened," Callum said. She didn't respond. "I know you tried to reach me," he continued. "I know you didn't leave. Still nothing. I was wrong," he said plainly. "And I didn't fight hard enough to be right." Zariah studied him for a long moment. Not for tears, not for regret, for truth. "You don't get to rewrite the past," she said calmly. "I know," Callum replied. "I'm not asking to..." He didn't justify himself. He didn't explain away the silence. He didn't ask for forgiveness. "I missed years I can't reclaim," he said. "I won't pretend that knowing the reason makes that acceptable." Zariah's expression didn't change. "I won't center myself in this," he continued. "I won't ask you to soften what you had to carry. I won't ask Nia to see me as anything other than what I've been." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I will show up, not grandly, not loudly, consistently. I'll be here for appointments," he said, "for questions, for support, not when it's convenient, when it's required." Zariah held his gaze. "You don't get partial presence," she said. "You don't get to disappear when this stops being uncomfortable." "I won't," he replied. Not a promise meant to impress, a commitment meant to be tested. He accepted the rules without negotiation, accepted that trust would not come quickly, if it came at all. Guilt settled in him, but he didn't let it turn inward into self-pity. He didn't wallow. He didn't dramatize his regret. He focused on action, listening, on staying. For the first time in his life, Callum understood that accountability wasn't about saying the right thing. It was about being present long after words stopped mattering. And this time, he wasn't leaving the door open for doubt. Zariah did not reward Callum's return with warmth. She acknowledged it. There was a difference, and she made sure he understood it from the beginning. The days after the truth came out settled into a rhythm shaped by necessity, not emotion. Hospital visits followed schedules. Conversations focused on care plans, test results, and logistics. Zariah kept her tone even, her words precise. She did not revisit the past unless clarity required it. Callum noticed immediately what she did not offer. No smiles meant to reassure him, no invitations to linger longer than needed, no easing of the distance he had created. She spoke to him like someone assessing reliability. Because that was exactly what she was doing. Zariah had learned the cost of early comfort. She had learned that offering softness before safety often invited disappointment. So she chose restraint, not as punishment, but as protection. When Callum arrived early for appointments, she nodded and continued what she was doing. When he asked questions, she answered factually. When he apologized again, quietly and sincerely, she didn't stop him, but she didn't affirm him either. "You don't need to keep saying it," she told him once, not unkindly. "Just be where you say you'll be." That was the standard. She set boundaries with clarity. He would not make decisions without her. He would not explain Nia's condition to others without permission. He would not assume emotional access just because he had biological ties. Zariah watched how he responded to limits. He accepted them. That mattered. She did not confuse restraint with bitterness. There was no hostility in her distance, only discipline. Zariah's strength had always been quiet, built through choices that favored long-term stability over short-term relief. At night, when she returned home alone, she allowed herself to think, to process what this new reality meant. She did not rush toward hope. She examined it from every angle. Forgiveness, she knew, was not the same as access. Trust was not owed. It was earned. And while Callum had taken the first steps, the road ahead was long. Zariah intended to walk it with her eyes open. Callum learned quickly that presence did not come with applause. Hospital nights were quiet and long. He sat in chairs not designed for comfort, watching monitors he did not fully understand, learning the difference between waiting and helping. Sometimes Zariah spoke to him. Sometimes she didn't. He'd either way. He watched how she mothered, how she noticed changes before machines did, how she spoke to nurses with respect while advocating firmly, how she balanced gentleness with authority without raising her voice. This was Black motherhood as lived practice, not theory, not stereotype, not struggle put on display. It was competence. It humbled him. Callum did not try to insert himself where he didn't belong. He asked before acting. He listened more than he spoke. He learned Nia's routines. What calmed her, what tired her, what made her smile. When Nia asked simple questions, he answered honestly without overwhelming her. He didn't claim a role he hadn't earned. He showed up in small ways, holding her water, reading quietly nearby, staying late even when nothing seemed to be happening. Zariah noticed. Not immediately, but steadily. Consistency has a way of making itself visible without demanding recognition. One evening, when Zariah stepped out briefly to take a call, she returned to find Callum sitting on the floor beside Nia's bed, helping her sort colored pencils into neat rows. They weren't talking much. They didn't need to. The moment passed without comment. But something shifted. Not forgiveness, understanding. Callum began to grasp the weight of what Zariah had carried alone, not through stories, but through observation. He saw the precision of her care, the endurance behind her calm, the discipline that had protected their daughter for years without his help. He did not romanticize it. He respected it, and for the first time, he understood that fatherhood did not begin with recognition. It began with patience. Do you believe consistency matters more than apologies? What formed between Zariah and Callum after the hospital days did not come with a name. There were no conversations about what they were, no reassurances offered to ease uncertainty, no attempts to define a future that had not yet earned its shape. Instead, there was understanding. It began with shared responsibility. Callum adjusted his schedule without announcing it. Meetings moved. Flights were delayed or canceled altogether. He made space, not dramatically, not performatively, but consistently. When appointments were scheduled, he there. When decisions needed to be made, he deferred to Zariah without resentment. Zariah noticed how he moved now. He no longer assumed leadership by default. He waited. He asked. He listened for cues instead of creating direction. The shift wasn't exaggerated. It was disciplined. They communicated often, but never excessively. Their exchanges stayed grounded in what mattered most: Nia's health, Nia's comfort, Nia's sense of safety. When disagreements surfaced, they were handled quietly, without raised voices, without power plays. Zariah respected that Callum didn't argue for control. Callum respected that Zariah didn't soften standards to make him comfortable. They learned how to work alongside each other. Two adults with shared history, shared responsibility, and very different emotional timelines. Mutual respect became the foundation. Not attraction, not nostalgia. Respect? Callum didn't attempt to rewrite his role. He accepted that he was learning from the margins, inward. He didn't expect praise for showing up. He understood that consistency wasn't a favor. It was the minimum. Zariah, in turn, acknowledged his effort without inflating it. She allowed him space to grow into fatherhood without letting him bypass accountability. She spoke plainly when expectations needed to be clarified. She trusted her instincts and stayed firm when they warned her not to rush. There were moments, small ones, where shared understanding surfaced naturally. A look exchanged across a room when Nia laughed unexpectedly. A shared pause before answering a difficult question. A moment of quiet relief when test results improved. None of it was labeled. None of it needed to be. They weren't rebuilding what they had lost. They were building something entirely different. Something rooted in reality, not hope alone. If love returned at all, it did so without spectacle. Didn't arrive in declarations or dramatic gestures. Didn't demand recognition or reassurance. It emerged cautiously, shaped by earned trust and quiet hope. Zariah didn't feel swept away. She felt steady. Callum didn't feel redeemed. He felt, accountable. That difference mattered. They spent time together beyond the hospital, but never alone at first. Shared meals with Nae present. Short walks, practical conversations that sometimes drifted into softer territory before settling back into safety. Zariah noticed how Callum laughed now. Less guarded, more present. She noticed how he listened without planning responses. She noticed how he accepted correction without defensiveness. Callum noticed how Zariah carried herself when she wasn't bracing, how her humor surfaced naturally, how warmth returned in small, unguarded moments when she felt safe. There was no fairy tale rush, no attempt to reclaim the past. Both understood that what they had once shared belonged to another version of themselves, people who hadn't yet been tested by absence, silence, and consequence. This version of love, if it could be called that, was quieter, more deliberate, built on proof instead of promise. Trust developed gradually, not because either of them demanded it, but because it became reasonable. Callum followed through repeatedly. Zariah allowed herself to observe without fear of disappointment. Hope didn't overwhelm her. It waited. She didn't imagine outcomes. She stayed present. She allowed moments to exist without asking them to guarantee a future. One evening, after Nia had fallen asleep, they sat across from each other at the kitchen table. No music, no distractions. "I don't expect anything," Callum said calmly. "I'm not here to pressure you." Zariah nodded. "Good. I'm willing to earn whatever place I'm allowed," he continued, "even if that place never looks the way I imagined." Zariah studied him for a long moment. "That's the first honest thing you could have said," she replied. There was no embrace, no resolution, but there was something else. Quiet hope grounded in reality. And that hope didn't frighten her, because this time it wasn't built on what might be. It was built on what already was. There are stories that end with victory, and then there are stories that end with understanding. Zariah and Callum's journey never became a tale of perfect timing or effortless reunion. It became something more honest and far more instructive, because ambition, when left alone, does not build a life. It builds distance. Callum had achieved everything he was taught to pursue: influence, expansion, control, recognition. Yet none of those things had prepared him for the quiet reckoning that arrived in a pediatric clinic, standing across from a woman who had carried the weight of absence without asking for permission. Success had given him reach, but not depth. And depth, he learned too late, was where life actually happened. Zariah's strength was never displayed for applause. It never asked to be admired. It existed because it had to. While ambition pushed Callum forward, responsibility anchored Zariah in place. She did not have the option to escape discomfort. She learned how to move through it with dignity. That difference mattered. Silence had once felt like protection to both of them. To Callum, it had been a shield, something that allowed him to move forward without confronting uncertainty. To Zariah, silence had been imposed, leaving her to interpret abandonment where there was none intended. But silence does not heal. It only delays truth. And when truth finally surfaced, it didn't arrive to assign blame. It arrived to demand accountability. Callum's growth did not come from discovering the manipulation. It came from accepting what he failed to question, from recognizing that love, when it matters, must be defended, not assumed safe. Zariah's growth did not come from surviving alone. It came from refusing to let survival harden her into someone unrecognizable. She remained open, but disciplined, hopeful, but measured. Strength in this story never shouted. It showed up early. It stayed late. It followed through when no one was watching. Zariah taught her daughter that love does not disappear because one person fails. That family is built through presence, not promises. That worth is not defined by who stays or leaves, but by how you show up for yourself and others. Callum learned that fatherhood is not claimed. It is practiced. That remorse without action is hollow. That returning late does not entitle you to warmth. And yet, love was not erased. It was tested. It survived silence. It endured distance. It adapted into something less fragile. What remained was not the love they once had. It was thing truer, a shared understanding built on honesty, a connection shaped by responsibility, a future grounded in reality, not fantasy. This story does not say everyone gets a second chance. It says that when truth arrives, what you do next matters more than what you missed. The image that closes this story is not dramatic. There is no sweeping music, no grand declaration, no perfect symmetry. There is simply a moment. Zariah sits at a park bench on a quiet afternoon, watching Nia climb carefully across the playground bars. Callum stands a few steps away, not directing, not hovering, just present. Available on attentive? Nia laughs, looking back at them both. Zariah meets Callum's eyes briefly, not with certainty, not with promise, with trust earned in increments. They are not flawless. They are not finished, but they are here together in the way that matters most. This, not a story about a billionaire saving a child. It is a story about a woman who saved herself first, a child who was loved completely, and a man who learned, too late, but not too late to try, that presence is the only currency love respects. And maybe that is the lesson worth carrying forward. Ambition builds power, but love builds legacy. Silence delays pain, but truth creates healing. Strength does not announce itself. It proves itself over time. And love, when real, does not rush. It remains. Like if this story moved you. Comment your takeaway. What stood out to you most? Subscribe for more American love stories. Because stories like this don't just entertain. They remind us who we are and who we still have the chance to become.